Hey, it's good to see everybody, or I guess as best we can for right now. It looks like a lot of us are going to be spending a lot more time at home and a lot less time in our usual busy routines. Even the time spent at home is going to be different now. Instead of time just spent there relaxing or stopping in to do whatever, now we're working from there. Or our kids are going to school from there. And it can be a bit different. We may be wondering what it is we're going to do with ourselves while this is going on. We may see this as a great time to do some unfinished projects. Maybe some great time to do some spring cleaning. Maybe it's time to do some organization. Maybe we want to spend a lot of time following what's going on with this virus and what the projections are. Any of these things could probably be are okay. There's nothing wrong with any of it. As a matter of fact, we ought to be informed about what's going on. We ought to be involved in our kids' school work. Right? We ought to be diligent about doing the things that we need to do. I mean, there's projects that need to be done, all kinds of things. It can really be an enjoyable time. But any of these things can serve as a distraction, and sometimes maybe not even a good one if we don't pay attention to them, if we don't focus in on the priorities that we really should have. You know, time at home may be looking a lot different now that you look around and you got everybody there. What are we going to do with them? Maybe it's, I'm bored, I can't leave, I'd like to go do this, but I can't. We're being told to stay away from groups of containing certain numbers of people so that we try to keep the spread of this down, and so this is as short-lived as possible. What are we going to do with ourselves? I got a suggestion, and it's only a suggestion, but I hope it to be a good one, and I hope it to be helpful. What about Sabbath? We're in the middle of almost what could almost be seen as a forced Sabbath in some ways. And I know, we're going, oh, this Sabbath, it's an Old Testament thing. It's an Israel thing. It's something that Jesus really didn't even speak all that highly of, but I think he did. It's a people of God thing. The Sabbath is really first mentioned or by name in Exodus chapter 16, and it's after the children of Israel have left Egypt, and God is leading them to Sinai, and they have nothing to eat. And so God has promised to feed them. And he said, I'm going to feed you for 6 days, but on the seventh day is the Sabbath, and you're to rest. So don't go out looking for food on the seventh day, because God's going to provide what you need on the sixth day, so that the seventh day you can rest and keep this Sabbath. That seems a little odd, really, if we're kind of walking through Scripture. It may seem a little odd that we have this directive about Sabbath when the Sabbath hasn't even been mentioned as part of the law until we get to Sinai in chapter 20. But I think it is something that God's trying to instill in his people, is this trust in him, is this confidence that he's going to provide for them. When we actually get to the giving of the law, when we start talking about the Sabbath as it relates to the Ten Commandments, it's one of the longest sections within that little section of the Ten Commandments. A lot of them are fairly short, right? Do not murder, right? Do not commit adultery, do not steal, do not bear false witness. These seem to be pretty short, but Sabbath is kind of extended. So I want you to read this with me in Exodus chapter 20, and it begins in verse 8. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son, or your daughter, or your male servant, or your female servant, or your livestock, or the sojourner who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made the heaven and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them. And he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the God blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. So here we have, again, a rather lengthy reading in what we also refer to a lot of times as the Decalogue, or the 10 words. This seems to be expanded and gives reason for why we keep the Sabbath, why Israel is to keep the Sabbath. Sabbath becomes a really important part of the identity of Israel. As a matter of fact, from this point through the book of Deuteronomy, that Sabbath is mentioned by name more than 20 times. More than 20 times God says something about the Sabbath and it being a holy Sabbath and it being need to be kept holy, and relates Israel's identity a lot to this Sabbath keeping. So when we start to dig into Sabbath and what it's all about, there are really two main reasons that are given here, one in Exodus and another one in Deuteronomy, of why Israel is to keep the Sabbath. The first one is, we've already said, creation. God who created the heavens, the earth, the sea, and all that is in them. God who has created this world. This all belongs to Him. God who has set this whole thing in motion. It's a reminder to Israel that God has set this in motion and He's still in control. He's got this. That the world spinning and things being done is not dependent on Israel to continue to work. It's God working. And that they can rest and they can take comfort in that fact that God has them. The God who created this entire world has them. Now, the other reason given is in Deuteronomy. In Deuteronomy chapter 5, we have the second giving of the law. And there's a different reason given there. It's going to sound really familiar as we start to read it, but we're going to find that there's another reason to remember the Sabbath. You ready? Deuteronomy chapter 5, and I think this one starts in verse 12. Observe the Sabbath day to keep it holy, as the Lord your God commanded you. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter or your male servant or your female servant or your ox or your donkey or any of your livestock or the sojourner that's within your gates. It sounds really familiar, right? It's exactly what we read in Exodus chapter 20. It says, that your male servant, your female servant may rest as well as you. You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day. This doesn't just have to do with creation. This has to do with deliverance. They're to keep the Sabbath because it's the God who created and the God who delivered. A reminder to them of who they belong to. A reminder to them of no matter what's going on in this journey, and this is going to be a statute that they're to keep, that this is a reminder that it's God who created you and it's God who delivers you. In chapter 16 of Exodus, there's a really interesting little phrase that I have read past for most of my life, where it says, the Lord your God is giving you the Sabbath. It's a gift. It's a blessing that God is giving. And I think that is the idea that Jesus is referring to when he speaks about Sabbath in Mark. In Mark chapter 2, it's in one of those times where Jesus is in hot water with the religious elite about not keeping the Sabbath or not doing it correctly. And Jesus says that the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. That the Sabbath was made and given to Israel, given to God's people. This is something unique for them. The other nations don't seem to have this. And this is one of those times where Israel is to confess, as a group of followers of God, that they trust the God who's leading them, that they trust the God who's created them, they trust the God who has delivered them, that they belong to Him. When we come to the New Testament, we really don't find any place where this is repeated, right? We don't really find this, and this is the day that you need to do this. But I think the principles are still right there with us. And I think right now, in what might even be seen as somewhat of a forced Sabbath, might be a good time. Might be a good time for you and me, as God's people, to unplug. Maybe to turn off the TV. Maybe to put down the phones. Maybe instead of trying to figure out where everybody's going to be in the house so that we can all have peace, maybe instead of each one being in different rooms as we get work done or as we get different projects done or all those things, maybe it's a time when we gather our families together, and we remember the story of God. Where we remember that it's God who has created us. That we remember that this is the earth that God created. This is His. And that while I do not believe that God created the coronavirus, I believe that God can handle the coronavirus. That God can deal with it and deal with it correctly. And that we need only to trust in Him. To listen to the guidance that we're given. To do the best we can to respect the life that He has given us. But to trust that God is the one who's going to handle this. We still need to be informed. We still need to be engaged. But our lives need to be a confession that we trust God who created us and God who delivers us. As God brings Israel out of Egypt, he states over and over that He wants others to understand who He is by the actions of Israel. I think maybe this is a good time for us to develop this habit of confessing, not just with our mouths, but with our very lives, that we trust God who created us. We trust God who delivers us. The God who delivered us not with one outstretched arm, but with two. Two outstretched arms on a cross outside of the city of Jerusalem. Maybe it's time we cultivate this habit. So that whenever this does pass, and it will, that we don't get so caught up in the busyness and believing that it's us as humans who drive the world forward. But it's the God who created, the God who sustains, the God who delivers. And we can demonstrate our trust in Him, not just when times are bad like now, not just when the future's uncertain like now, but it begins to cultivate a habit that every day we begin to do this. Maybe we start to set aside a time where we just do that, where we just sit and listen, and we just sit and thank God, sit and tell the stories and look at the things that He's done in our lives. We're going to all be back together again soon. I just wanted to kind of reach out and maybe give us a little bit of something that we can deal with, can work with as we deal and work through this crisis and work through this issue that's facing us. Remember, we are God's people, and He's got this. And may God bless us as we continue to trust and to continue to lean into Him.